Thank you for your interest in envisioning a more just child welfare system. My talk today is drawn from a program of research on moral injury extending over the past 8 years. My partners have included social work PhD students, community mental health professionals, and colleagues from Volunteers of America. Their contributions were essential to the success of this research program, and we are all grateful for funding from the Annie E. Casey Foundation and Gamble Scodwell Endowment. The objectives of today's talk are to extend the study of moral injury beyond veterans to other at-risk populations. In this case, child welfare involves parents, professionals, and young people. Second, we will illustrate how the Moral Injury Event Scale, the MEIS, which was designed to measure moral injury in military populations, may be modified for use with other groups. Third, we will consider how characteristics of a social system, in this case epistemic injustice, may place individuals at risk for moral injury. And finally, we will consider the implications for preventing or alleviating moral injury within social systems. Around the world, child welfare systems provide essential services to children who are abused and neglected. These systems are necessary and in some cases life-saving. And yet the U.S. child welfare system remains tainted by bias, despite decades of reform efforts. In this talk, we consider how to re-envision a more just child welfare system that protects without harming vulnerable children and families, many of whom are already struggling with issues such as poverty, racism, and unmet mental health needs. In this talk, I will argue that in our child welfare systems, the moral frameworks of those in power too often are imposed on diverse families whose voices may be silenced even as they seek to testify about their own lives. In other words, epistemic injustice is a characteristic of our public child welfare systems. I also will argue that the system characteristic, epistemic injustice, places those within it at risk for moral injury. In other words, when a social system, in this case a public child welfare system, bends towards epistemic injustice, that is when it devalues the knowledge and wisdom of an individual or cultural group, it leaves those within it vulnerable to lasting psychological, spiritual, and social harm caused by the transgression of deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. It can result in feelings of rage, existential despair, shame, and guilt that persist, sometimes for years, and undermine well-being. Consider the cases of Hannah, Dana, and Sarah. Hannah immigrated to the U.S. as a 9-year-old to join her mother, who had left her in the care of her grandmother in Ethiopia as a toddler. When she was 13 years old, she was placed in foster care after calling 911 for injuries she sustained from her mother's physical abuse. She then experienced conflicts with her caseworker, whom she had trusted to help her. She felt the caseworker failed to listen to her and instead worked to reunite her with her mother, who continued to cut, burn, berate, and socially isolate her. Quote, I felt like she reflected her own culture. I was telling her there were things I was scared to talk about, so just keep me away from our home. But she just kept working towards taking me back to the family. End of quote. And consider Dana, a young single Black mother of 3 who was accused of physically abusing her school-aged son. She felt that child welfare workers and the county attorney acted immorally by silencing and attacking her in court, portraying her as a quote-unquote monster who wanted to harm her children after she had spanked them to deter their unsafe behavior. Her school-aged boys, ages 7 and 10, had been running around the neighborhood without permission and at night. She then described being the victim of actual childhood physical abuse herself and was adamant that unlike her mother, she would never hurt her children. She appeared particularly devastated and shamed by the accusations professionals were making about her because they threatened her deeply held sense of herself as a mother. a parent who would never engage in the abusive behavior she had experienced as a child. Sarah is a white social worker with over 17 years of experience. She expressed pride in her profession and in her identity as a social worker. Yet working within the child welfare system created an existential dissonance. She explained, quote, "I feel really strongly about our child protection system and the way in which it is really broken. I'm troubled as a social worker by what feels like my own complicity. I'm troubled by the ways in which we're failing families and society as a whole. The systems that are supposed to be there to protect children and families that I have seen really do the opposite in the majority of the cases. I find it difficult as a social worker to so strongly not believe in one of the systems that is primarily run by social workers." Hannah, Dana, and Sarah are experiencing the child welfare system from three distinct social vantage points, developmental periods, and cultural contexts, and yet all three express moral injury. Hannah, a vulnerable immigrant child, felt a deep and persistent sense of betrayal when a caseworker she trusted to protect her failed to listen to her, resulting in further abuse. Dana, a young African-American mother, remained badly shaken by the portrayal of her by professionals she assumed would be fair. Sarah, an experienced midlife caseworker, felt deeply conflicted by her inability to live her social work values within the child welfare system. The narratives of Hannah, Dana, and Sarah may sound familiar to those affected by the U.S. child welfare system. Many of the young people and parents who participated in our research have been in dire need of a helping hand due to a variety of complex issues. Many of the child welfare professionals who participated in our research have worked with diligence, wisdom, and skill to provide that assistance. And some other parents, such as Hannah's mother, may never be safe or adequate caregivers, and their children do need to find permanent homes elsewhere. Indeed, all of the children, parents, and professionals are fallible human beings who could likely benefit from additional education, skill development, or therapeutic intervention. The proliferation of such resources for parents and professionals has been a focus of efforts to strengthen the expanding child welfare system for decades. These resources do not touch the harm involvement in the child welfare system itself does to the very children and parents it is entrusted with helping, and to the professionals working within its system. Western child welfare systems emerged from deep moral roots, extending back to the Hammurabi codes and ancient Jewish and Christian doctrines. Their response to transgression of widespread moral values, that is, the abuse or neglect of innocent children, as well as the moral obligations of the society to protect children and cultivate the next generation of responsible citizens. Yet the research program I'll be describing for you today indicates that young people, parents, and frontline professionals involved in the child welfare system actually experience moral injury as a result of their experiences within a system that silences their voices and devalues or ignores their knowledge and wisdom. We will consider the implications of listening to and acting on their voices for propelling efforts to address persistent challenges within the U.S. child welfare system. How then did we go about examining these complex issues of epistemic injustice and moral injury in child welfare systems? Our research program uses a mixed methods design. It has a modest quantitative component and a more developed qualitative component. We use the moral injury events scale to place our participants' experiences within the broader literature on moral injury. The qualitative component allows us to elaborate on the context and meaning of morally injurious events reported on the MEAS. Our research questions are: do some parents, professionals, and young people report moral injury in relation to their experiences associated with the child welfare system? If so, what events do they describe as morally injurious? How do they describe the psychosocial spiritual effects of these events? And how do they heal from moral injury? Our aim in recruiting participants was to draw upon those with a variety of different perspectives on the child welfare system. In other words, we recruited for diversity. We recruited parents and child welfare involved professionals from Minnesota, 9 mothers and 1 father. 5 had open cases, and 5 had closed cases, and 2 had had their parental rights terminated. There were 13 social workers serving a variety of roles, including investigators and supervisors. There were 15 attorneys, both county attorneys prosecuting cases and those defending parents. And there were 10 other adults. We recruited emerging adults with child welfare histories. 25 had aged out of foster care. They were recruited from Illinois, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Michigan. 20 were young women and 8 young men. They were Indigenous, African American, Latino, Roma, and white, and they were between the ages of 18 and 25. The instrument for the quantitative component was a modified version of the Moral Injury Event Scale, or the MEES. It was developed for use with military personnel and veterans. It has 3 subscales. The first 2 subscales, transgressions self and transgressions of others, are generally relevant to other contexts. For example, I saw things that were morally wrong. I am troubled by those things I witnessed that were morally wrong. I acted in ways that violated my own moral code or values. With minor modifications, the 3rd subscale, the betrayal subscale, also can be relevant to other contexts. For example, we changed I feel betrayed by leaders who I once trusted to I feel betrayed by professionals who I once trusted. The instructions to the MEES clarified that by moral, we're not referring to some particular set of moral or religious beliefs. Rather, participants are asked to respond on the basis of their own beliefs about what is right, wrong, just, or unjust, and to consider in particular the events surrounding and including their involvement in the child welfare system. Participants respond using a 6-point Likert scale, ranging from 1 strongly disagree to 6 strongly agree. The qualitative component of our studies include individual audio-recorded interviews that elaborate on those MEES responses in the context of telling a life story. Prompts included, tell me about yourself and how you came to be involved in the child welfare system. And I noticed that you wrote strongly agree with, I saw things that were morally wrong. Can you tell me more about that? So we wanted to understand the context of the moral injury, where it occurred, the people involved, and also the participants' reaction, the impact on their lives, and how they soothe moral injury. We also, our study also included loosely structured field notes where we described the participants' general demeanor during our encounters, the physical and social context of the interview, and salient interview themes. And our research also concluded a questionnaire that we developed to describe participants' personal histories and demographic characteristics. They reported their gender, ethnicity, age, when they first became involved in child welfare systems, and how many years they were involved in child welfare services, their level of education, income, occupation, and whether or not they were parents. So our data was collected during individual in-person sessions that lasted about 90 minutes. They were conducted at a private location of each participant's choosing, such as a home, a private room in a library, or an office. They then completed the personal history demographic questionnaire. Next, the revised moral injury event scale. And finally, an audio recorded qualitative life story interview elaborating on the MEES. So what then did we find? This table shows Go back. Shows the means for military personnel and child welfare involved participants on Mies subscales. I included in this table military personnel from a 2015 study by Byron et al. As a rough benchmark for interpreting the experiences of child welfare involved participants. We consider subscale scores above the midpoint of 3 as potentially indicating moral injury. What we find is that the mean subscale for parents, professionals, and emerging adults are mostly above the subscale midpoint and look similar to those of military personnel. Further, we see at the bottom of the table that 8 of 10 parents, 35 of 38 professionals, and 38 of 38 emerging adults scored above the midpoint of 3 on at least one subscale. So when asked to elaborate on their Mies scores above the scale midpoint, what events and experiences did they describe as morally injurious? Well, not surprising, the direct or indirect exposure of child abuse, infliction of deliberate harm on children through physical, emotional, sexual abuse, was identified by most participants as morally injurious. This abuse was perpetrated primarily by parents, but also foster parents, congregate care providers, and kinship caregivers. Also concerning, most participants described events surrounding their interactions with child welfare involved professionals as morally injurious. For example, 54% of emerging adults described as morally injurious the failure of professionals who they had trusted to help them, to listen to and protect them. And 25% described injuries to their identities as individuals worthy of respect. Parents perceived professionals they expected to be fair to be shaming. Professionals reported as morally injurious participation with other professionals they perceived to be unfair and cruel to struggling parents. And finally, most participants described as morally injurious their encounters resulting from characteristics of the child welfare system itself, that is, events stemming from problematic rules, procedures, policies, and laws. Now, there was a fair amount of overlap between, so that this, what I'd like to do now is then look more carefully at morally injurious events resulting from system characteristics. And you'll see that there's a fair amount of overlap between professionals and parents regarding system characteristics that contribute to moral injury. And many of these characteristics may reflect epistemic injustice at the system level. The picture that emerges is one of a system that is under-resourced with high caseloads and poor quality services that make it difficult to communicate, engage, and form relationships necessary for real change to occur, especially when parents feel silenced and attacked within an adversarial legal system, experience systemic biases such as racism, sexism, and classism, and when they observe harm to children within the system. As a group, emerging adults were less explicit about system characteristics that contribute to moral injury, and it is important for future research to ask them explicitly. When asked to make recommendations, however, they did explicitly describe system characteristics that would support epistemic justice. That is, they describe that there needs to be a system where children are listened to, treated as human, where their opinions and voice are valued, and where they have a seat at the table. So why does this matter? Paying attention to moral injury matters because moral injury causes suffering. In addition, that suffering creates obstacles to addressing the very real problem of child maltreatment. Consistent with the literature on moral injury experienced by veterans, parents reporting moral injury described feelings of guilt, grief, shame, rage, and loss of trust. In this case, loss of trust in professionals and emotional disengagement from services. Likewise, professionals describe feelings of rage and grief, emotional numbing, guilt, and shame. Many also describe troubling existential issues, including their ability to function in an ethical and moral manner within a system they viewed as deeply flawed and in an unsupportive working environment steeped in human misery. Nearly a third of all professionals describe themselves or colleagues as actively seeking employment elsewhere. Emerging adults describe responses similar to adults: rage, shame, guilt, and feelings of betrayal. When reflecting on moral injury experienced in childhood, they also describe developmentally distinct responses, including feelings of vulnerability, confusion, and worthlessness as children. They also link longer-term challenges to experiences of moral injury in childhood and adolescence, including current relationship problems, mental health, and substance abuse disorders. Participants also describe ways in which they have soothed their moral injury using resources within their everyday environment. This information may be useful to those developing sustainable, culturally acceptable interventions to support those struggling with moral injury. Similar to the literature on veterans, participants describe strengthening their psychological resilience through meaning-making activities. They describe reorienting their narratives of moral injury away from guilt, shame, rage, and despair, and towards hope, gratitude, forgiveness, and personal courage. And this is very consistent with the positive psychology literature. They also describe relationships, social support, and corrective experiences as critical to coping with or healing from moral injuries. They describe engagement in advocacy and other social programs to support others struggling with moral injury, that is, community engagement, and some describe spiritual engagement. Our research is the first to consider moral injury in child welfare involved individuals, and the first to consider moral injury experienced by children. Our understanding, however, is very incomplete. There's still a lot of work to do. First, what are the perspectives of foster parents? Foster parents have critical roles to play in the child welfare system. Second, emerging adults' reflections were retrospective. Research is needed with children and adolescents. Third, open-ended interviews were analyzed inductively. This is very important for research that aims to understand the experiences, perspectives, beliefs, and practices of cultural insiders while minimizing the imposition of the frameworks of outsiders, particularly those in positions of power. But now that we have some understanding of those frameworks, it's important to follow up with some more structured interviews. How many participants would endorse these inductively derived themes if directly asked to address them? What would their responses add to our understanding of those themes? Which leads to our final point, considering transferability. Our sample was drawn from the Midwest. The extent to which these findings are transferable to other contexts within the Midwest and elsewhere is an open empirical question. What we can say is that the participants in our research were diverse. We heard from adults and young people. We heard from child welfare involved professionals and clients. We heard from individuals from Indigenous, African American, Latino, and white communities. Across these groups, socially positioned very differently, we heard common themes of moral injury sustained within a system perceived to be characterized by epistemic injustice. What then are the implications? Very broadly, we need to listen to and then act on the voices from within the child welfare system. We need to prioritize a system that moves away from epistemic injustice to build psychological resilience, relationships, community engagement, and spirituality in struggling families. The question is, how do we do this? And in particular, are there existing models from which we can learn? This is a question for another time, but I can make some suggestions based on our ethnographic research with 3 different cultural communities. And these are just 3 exemplars. There are many other child welfare systems with practices and policies that vary from the U.S. from which we can learn. It's important to underscore that I'm not advocating that the practices and policies of these culturally embedded cases be exported to the U.S. system. Rather, I've selected 3 cases to stimulate a creative re-envisioning of the U.S. system that centers epistemic justice. More specifically, I selected these cases as models that prioritize the cultural values of psychological resilience, relationship building, and community engagement. The practices embodying these values may suggest ways to promote epistemic justice and minimize the experience of moral injury within the U.S. child welfare system. Okay, so first, I will just describe these 3 alternative models and note that they all have flaws and none can be directly imported to the U.S., but they all have lessons to teach us. First, the treatment of African Americans throughout U.S. history and today is a story of breathtaking and continuing moral transgression. Examples are abundant of both exclusion from the child welfare services and the punitive overrepresentation of Black families. Jillian Jimenez's historical research describes a shadow system of child welfare in African American communities beginning at the end of the 19th century in response to the exclusion of African American children from the public child welfare system. Such systems exist today, and they continue to operate. For example, the Minnesota One Stop for Communities Parent Mentor Program was conceptualized, spearheaded, and run by African American mothers previously involved in the child welfare system. These community mothers designed the program to pass down wisdom, skills, and strategies to parents currently involved in the formal child welfare system. Their goal is to reduce the involvement of Black families in child welfare, provide them with support as they navigate their cases, and build protective factors for families and community resources. By design, the Minnesota One Stop Communities Parent Mentor Program exists alongside of, not as part of, state, county, or tribal child welfare systems. Second, we could look at the Japanese child welfare system. This is a system that is primarily preventative and focuses on the well-being of all children. Social workers also focus on building long-term relationships with families who are struggling to provide preventive support over a period of years. Only a few cases per year are resolved through the court system, and the termination of parental rights is all but unheard of, as children are part of the family line, including ancestors. We could also look at the Scottish child welfare system. By design, this system is disengaged from the criminal justice system, with only the most severe cases resolved through the court system, and these cases are resolved in a criminal court system. Rather, there's a system of community-based children's panels consisting of trained community members, including volunteers, professional social workers, and advocates who focus on identifying and connecting families to needed resources. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with a sense of the resilience and wisdom of the participants in our research. Anya, one of our emerging adults who spent her childhood in foster care and continued to receive financial support from transition services through college, obtained a BS degree in social work. At the time of the interview, she was working as a child welfare professional and raising a young child. She disclosed that part of her motivation to go into child welfare were her morally injurious experiences of not being heard and helped as a child. Quote, "I knew that the system was broken. There were times where I mentioned that something was happening to me and nobody did anything about it. And I just felt by me being in those shoes and me being the kids that I'm working with today, I'll be able to look at things from a different perspective. They always say, hey, we want to do what's in the best interest of the child. And because I've been that child, I feel like I have better insight. Those of us interested in re-envisioning a more just child welfare system have much to learn from those voices from within the system, young people, parents, and professionals." and thank you very much for your interest.